My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are very excited to bring you tonight's Neurodiversity Education Series with Dr. Meryl Alper. Take it away, Meryl. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bev and Charlene. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I'm very excited to be with you all where I'm coming from, Massachusetts at the moment. So excited to be sort of back, quote unquote, on the West Coast. So I am, going to talk to you today about thinking differently about the social uses of media, again, for neurodivergent youth. And I want to just include a note that part of what I'm talking about includes some of the potentially more socially ostracizing or, socially troubling issues around media that neurodivergent young people engage with. So I just want to note at the start of my talk that it does include some discussion of potentially upsetting topics, including bullying and attempted suicide. Also, before I kind of go any further, I'd like to share a little bit about myself and my background. So I started my professional career in the children's media industry back in 2003 when I was a college intern in the education and research department at Sesame Workshop. And since then, I've worked as a consultant, strategist, and educational researcher for companies like Nick Jr. and Disney Channel. And this work brought me out to Los Angeles, actually, in 2005, and I stayed to complete my PhD at USC. And outside of my work at Northeastern, I currently independently consult with organizations like PBS Kids and Apple TV+, helping to make their series, digital and interactive offerings more accessible and universally designed. And some of the shows that I've worked on, which are pictured here, have diversity and inclusion as explicit curriculum goals and educational philosophies, including Sesame Street, Molly of Denali, Ni Hao Kai Lan, and Hero Elementary. And the latter is especially notable in the context of this talk, as one of the show's lead characters, AJ Sparks, is a tech-savvy Black autistic boy. I've been a professor at Northeastern since 2015, and in my work there, accessibility, and more specifically disability, has been central to my research on young people's engagement with media and technology, including both the pros and cons of digital, personal, and mobile media. I started this work, it's interesting, not because I had such a personal connection to the population or the topic, but because to me, I noticed how disabled children were more often talked about as patients, or perhaps even students in the context of technology, but not as everyday kids with dreams and desires that their media and technology use reflected. And so I've written 3 books on this topic, all with MIT Press, pictured here: Digital Youth with Disabilities, Giving Voice, Mobile Communication, Disability and Inequality, and most recently, Kids Across the Spectrums, Growing Up Autistic in the Digital Age, which my talk will focus on today, or tonight rather. So with more possibilities than ever for technology use anytime, anywhere, young people's online and offline worlds are shaping one another in complex ways. And that's both for the better, like family members being able to readily stay in touch from a distance, and for the worse, as with teenagers' easy access to hateful rhetoric and extreme imagery on the internet. One population who acutely experiences this duality of risks and opportunities are children, adolescents, and teenagers on the autism spectrum. So I define autism in the broadest possible terms as a cognitive, biological, and behavioral phenomenon that influences how people move, think, and perceive the world around them. Some people on the spectrum are very talkative, while others may be unable to reliably communicate through oral speech. Some are intellectually gifted, while others have significant cognitive challenges. Some autistic individuals are highly sociable, while others prefer greater solitude. People are born autistic and remain so throughout their lives, that there is far more research on children than adults. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, among young people, the Centers for Disease Control here in the US estimates that 1 in 36 8-year-olds in the US had an autism diagnosis as of 2020. Through new media, today's autistic youth can discover unique opportunities for socializing, communicating, regulating their often dysregulated senses, and expressing themselves. For example, and this is all, I'm drawing on research that's all cited here. So for example, autistic adolescent boys report that video gaming with others helps them to feel part of a group. Teens on the spectrum, though, also encounter specific threats that are born of the internet and ubiquitous mobile devices. For instance, they often experience bullying due to their peers' lack of acceptance of their differences. These personal violations are complicated by the fact that privacy and safety features on social media can be difficult for them to understand and modify. These challenges may be additionally compounded by heightened risks of co-occurring mental health conditions among autistic people, including anxiety, depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD, and eating disorders. Problematic symptoms tend to increase over the course of adolescence, and for some, these have only really been intensified by the disruption to routine and stress that was caused by the pandemic and those longitudinal effects. My talk today focuses on the social dimensions of autistic young people's digital and mass media use, and the many possible meanings of social media for this population. I'm going to draw on research from my aforementioned book, Kids Across the Spectrums, which I'm very proud was awarded an honorable mention for the Best Book Award by the American Sociological Association and its Communication, Information, Technologies, and Media Sociology section. It's quite a handful, a mouthful rather. I would also like to note that the book is available digitally for free via open access on the MIT Press website if you go to this link, bit.ly/kids across the spectrums. The print version, if you're somebody who likes to read print, you would have to pay for, but a PDF of it is freely available. The book is the first ever in-depth ethnographic study of what autistic children and adolescents are doing with media and technology in their daily lives and in their own words. As such, the main point of my talk today is this. Though young people on the autism spectrum are regularly characterized, be it popularly or in clinical literature, as having social deficits, I argue that media and technology offer unique ways for autistic youth to express their sociality, despite the significant challenges and drawbacks of such social connectivity for this population. I'm going to share stories of several young people from my fieldwork who together illustrate how the social uses of technology among this population is incredibly multifaceted. I'll conclude by offering a few applied and sort of theoretical takeaways and reflections, and of course there'll be time for Q&A at the end. But first I'd like to provide some background on different philosophical approaches, I suppose, to sociality among people on the autism spectrum, and how this applies to autistic individuals' media and technology use, and that of autistic young people specifically. To begin, cognitive theorists have tended to dominate autism research. Cognitive theories have dominated autism research with little attention paid to how social contexts shape understandings and experiences of autism. The prefix "aut" in autism, you may be aware, comes from the Greek word autos, meaning self. The term autism was coined in 1911 by German psychiatrist Eugen Müller to describe people who he believed had an inner life, not readily accessible to others. The wide assumption of preferred solitude among those on the autism spectrum is currently undergoing resistance and revision by psychologists, anthropologists, and autism self-advocates. They contend that the social motivations of autistic people, do not rest solely within the diagnosed individual, but arise from dynamic interactions and relationships in specific contexts. For example, in a much commented upon 2019 article in the journal Behavioral and Brain Sciences, psychologists Vikram Jaswal and Meryl Alper argue that people on the spectrum appearing socially uninterested is not the same as them being socially uninterested. Anthropologists Eleanor Ox and Olga Solomon offer the term autistic sociality as an alternative concept that describes a form of sociality shared by autistic individuals that is not quantitatively less social than the form preferred among non-autistic people, but is instead qualitatively different. Human sociality encompasses a range of possibilities for social coordination shaped by situational contexts, materials, and dynamics of groups and individuals, with autistic sociality being one such permutation. Presumptions, however, about the right ways to be social with technology, that is, neurotypical, underlies much psychological work on autism and technology. For example, in their study, Prevalence and Correlates of Screen-Based Media Use Among Youths with Autism Spectrum Disorders, clinical psychologist Michael Miser and her colleagues write that a majority of autistic 13 to 17-year-olds in the US, quote, spent most of their free time using non-social media, television, video games, while less than a quarter of them spent time on social media, email, or internet chatting, end quote. So compared to children with intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, and speech and language impairments, autistic children used social media less and non-social media more. While it may be a clear-cut distinction from the purview of clinical psychology, deeming one type of media social and a whole other non-social is really difficult to do in my field of media and communication studies, where it's understood that people make all kinds of media, including television and video games, socially meaningful through their shared practices and experiences. The claim that young people on the spectrum choose less immediately socially interactive media due to their supposed social impairment is problematic because it doesn't consider how media and technology impact how people learn to participate in and contribute to society and the very meaning of sociality itself. When applied to research on autistic young people and their uses of technology specifically, being social has multiple meanings. This includes research on how media such as video games purportedly promote harmful antisocial behavior and exacerbate asocial self-isolation, and the development and deployment of instructional technologies such as virtual reality and robots intended to socialize autistic children. Taken together, the asocial, antisocial, and digital socialization framings of autistic children and their media use underpin the pervasive belief that screens should be educationally or therapeutically beneficial in order for them to be worthwhile for this population. And this imbalance is reflected in the lack of research on autistic youth's digital socializing, which takes place in physical and virtual social spaces. Autistic children adopt and appropriate media for their own socializing, and often on their own terms. This involves digital tools designed for and by autistic people, as well as those that youth on the spectrum adapt for social purposes. For example, through their digital ethnographic work, computer scientist Catherine Ringland and colleagues have studied Autcraft, a private Minecraft server that provides a supportive space for autistic children to play in the virtual world. What makes a technology a social technology, then, is negotiated across these different categories of sociality. For my book, I wanted to understand the gap between presumptions about autistic people's sociality and the realities of their social technology use, and what was gained from centering the perspectives of autistic young people and their own thoughts on the topic. I interviewed and observed over 60 autistic young people ages 3 to 13, living in Boston and Los Angeles from 2013 through the start of the pandemic in 2020. They were speaking and non-speaking. Some were autistic siblings, as in the left-hand photo, and many were the children of immigrants. I focused on their media consumption, creation, and circulation, such as the girl using Spotify on her mom's phone in the right-hand corner, so right-hand photo. I also talked with their caregivers about how technology fit into their family's overall habits, values, beliefs, and routines, as ethnographers have done with families of non-disabled children for years. I'll note that all names mentioned in this talk are pseudonyms for privacy's sake, and all faces and personally identifying information have been blurred or covered in photos. Employing what's known as a grounded theory approach, in which participant data is used to develop explanatory insights from the bottom up, I identified 3 overlapping areas of autistic children's successes and struggles with technology that I explore in the book: cultural belonging, social relationships, and physical embodiment. I examined how autistic youth make sense of where they belong culturally in terms of their identities in Chapter 2 and learning environments in Chapter 3. I studied the kinds of personal relationships they forge with family in Chapter 4 and friends in Chapter 5. And I tried to understand their embodied experiences of neurodivergence, namely their sensory processing in Chapter 6 and emotional processing in Chapter 7. In this talk, I'd like to draw primarily from my work in Chapter 5 on friends, though there's much to say about sociality in the context of parents and siblings in Chapter 4. I'd like to say a bit more before moving on about the role of media and technology in child friendships generally, social strengths and challenges that autistic youth face, and what's known about how technology increases their feelings of both belonging and exclusion. So tweens and teens today build relationships through social media, content sharing sites, messaging apps, and virtual worlds and games. Social media use is associated with both interpersonal benefits for adolescents and interpersonal challenges. Tween social media use is on the rise, though boys tend to make more friends online than girls, as regular video gameplay expands their social circles, and girls are more likely to do things like text frequently with existing friends. Autistic children tend to be more accepted by typically developing peers in younger grades, but later tend to move to the periphery of social networks. Despite their challenges, kids on the spectrum self-report desiring friends and say that they are generally satisfied by their friendships with neurotypical and neurodivergent children, though they vary in terms of their preferred frequency and type of social contact. So autistic kids' peer relationships can sometimes look qualitatively different from non-autistic children's friendships, such as maybe having less emotional intimacy and affective reciprocity. But it's important to note again that this difference is not necessarily a deficit per the perspective of autistic sociality. In terms of their participation in online social spaces and technology use, kids on the spectrum who are excluded in play by other kids are more likely to occupy their time with media. Among autistic adolescents, social media use is associated with high self-reported friendship quality, but it's unclear what aspect of social media might be associated with strong friendships, and it's hard to determine directionality or causality of those effects. So to summarize, media and communication technologies may offer kids on the spectrum novel opportunities for social connection, but it can potentially create roadblocks as well. And researchers have yet to spend much time speaking directly with autistic young people about how they navigate the mediated social world. What I found by doing so is that many autistic children are savvy curators of personal media ecosystems, through which they can feel comfortable reaching out and being reached out to by others. Connectivity, however, also exposes them to social situations with disproportionate potential for harm and victimization, and little protection from platforms and challenges seeking help from adults. Specifically, 4 key themes emerged from the analysis. that I'll get into with the key examples that I have. And I'll explain what these concepts mean. So media as social scaffolding, autistic children's agency in using media for social purposes, navigating online safety in social interactions, and contextual social factors. So first, with respect to scaffolding, media and technology serve as an on-ramp to social participation for many kids on the spectrum. For example, 12-year-old Brendan showed me videos from one of his favorite gamers on YouTube, Markiplier. We watched one video together that Brendan had viewed many times before, in which Markiplier played Little Nightmares, a horror adventure game. Brendan enabled the video's captions so that he could read aloud what Markiplier was saying, as well as simulate conversations with the YouTuber. "I don't know where I am now," Markiplier had said in reference to his in-game location, to which Brendan replied with friendly familiarity, "You never know where you are, Mark." Parasocial interactions and relationships, or what's known kind of in the media psychology literature as having to do with interactions and relationships that simulate sociality, those, along with media scripts, so literally with Brendan at times reading the captions that Markiplier had written, and Brendan said that he specifically liked that Markiplier had accurate captions. These scripts enabled autistic kids to play at and practice sociality using existing cultural material. In terms of agency, far from being passive actors, many young people on the spectrum make active choices about the media they use, how and when they use it socially, and in what circumstances. For instance, virtual and in-person clubs centered around specific media franchises allowed autistic tweens in my study to regularly connect with peers who had similar interests. 10-year-old Ronan, for example, played Dungeons and Dragons, getting together with friends to play in an organized group every other Sunday. When I asked him what he liked about playing D&D with friends, Ronan joked, quote, "You can't really single-handedly take down like a million monsters when they all have to make attacks against you. You're the only thing out there for them to attack if there's no friends." Next, pre-adolescent kids on the spectrum are also coming of age in a networked environment with endless potential for their social vulnerabilities to be taken advantage of, unfortunately, by cruel actors. For example, Brendan, who I was just talking about, his mom, Marcia, recalled a time in which her son wrote, "Can we be friends?" on social media, end quote, into the chat on Roblox, which surprised her. "Even though he wants friends," Marcia said, "he doesn't know how to probably maintain those friendships," end quote. She worried about Brendan not being able to determine another person's bad intentions, not only from the outside world, but also children from school with whom Brendan sometimes played Roblox. Maggie, mom of 12-year-old Sailor, also discussed with a heavy heart how her daughter had been bullied by girls that she thought were her friends. The girls told Sailor to post on Snapchat about wanting to take her own life, which Sailor then posted out of peer pressure. Another mother saw the message on her child's Snapchat and contacted Maggie, who, quote, "went into crisis mode." The incident led to Sailor attending counseling to talk about these issues. And by age 12, Sailor herself could reflect on her experiences and talk about them as part of her past, as well as within the current context of pervasive toxicity online. "The year I got bullied," she said, "I always got picked on for having really bad Instagram photos. I was like 9 and I didn't know. I just wanted to be cool and stuff." She subsequently changed some of her privacy settings, creating more intimate audiences through private Snapchat stories. Lastly, the social relationships that kids on the spectrum do or do not develop through technology have to do with far more than choices they actively make. The extent to which a given child may be seen by others in the first place as friendly or approachable is heavily shaped by societal factors like racism. And this is especially true for autistic youth in online and offline spaces. So Mom Audrey, for example, was keenly aware of how her 9-year-old Black autistic son, Caleb, who also had ADHD, was vulnerable to being read by others as aggressive and violent, which could directly impact interactions with powerful institutions like the police. How this relates to media is that she didn't want Caleb listening to rap songs with lyrics about guns or murder that he might repeat and be overheard around classmates, not fully understanding their meaning. These really, they're just snapshots from the lives of Brendan, Ronan, Sailor, and Caleb, start to fill out a much needed fuller picture of the social uses of media and technology among autistic children, adolescents, and teenagers, and both the opportunities and limitations that new media technologies offer them for connection. I have 3 kind of basic takeaways to share that are from their stories, more broadly from the young people that I spend time with for my book, and some of my newer research as well. So first, my analysis lends itself to several implications, I think, for parents, clinicians, policymakers, and other stakeholders in autistic children's lives. There is significant value, for example, in kids on the spectrum being able to play and practice interpersonal interactions and relationships online without all of the risks that come with being fully or publicly networked. Such places might give autistic adolescents opportunities to reflect on what another young youth and technology scholar, Katie Davis, terms spheres of obligation for presenting oneself online. So thinking about your interpersonal connections, online social norms, and broader cultural norms that a person might be expected to align with. Second is that there tends to be this reductive binary of young people's technology usage as either social, and so if they're social, then they'd be active and productive, or antisocial, and with that passive and consumptive. That framing of kind of that how kids use media as one or the other inherently renders neurodivergent youth deviant because it centers neurotypical children's friendships and relational norms. Kids on the spectrum may be repeatedly watching YouTube videos, for example, that provide them with instructive examples of social situations. Yes, they're not on social media, but kids like Brendan made YouTube social in a kind of way. Or they might be using ChatGPT and AI companions to practice tricky and delicate conversations before having them in person. Although an asterisk on this to say is that AI companions, there's been some high-profile cases recently of very negative and harmful mental health effects for young people who might be particularly susceptible to faux social interactions with an avatar, a computer program that is always agreeing with you and remembers things you've asked. That could be particularly dangerous for neurodivergent young people, for example, who also have anxiety or depression. Lastly, it is important to understand social differences in autistic kids' experiences of interpersonal interactions and relationships across types of media content and technology. Demographic differences by age, gender, race, and class, and variations in communication and intellectual disability with respect to how media meets their social needs. To conclude, autistic kids are kids. And like all kids, they have fundamental needs for feeling known. The relationships they forge can look a lot like those of neurotypical children, and yet may be quite different in other respects. Understanding autistic kids' mediated peer relationships through these lenses I've offered of scaffolding, agency, safety, and contextual factors allow us to reframe dominant considerations of technology, the social, and society that ultimately privilege non-disabled and neurotypical people. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening. And if you're interested in learning more, besides the links that I understand Bev has been leaving in the chat, you can just use this QR code. If you use also if you're one of those people who likes a QR code, use the camera on your phone to open this link that'll take you to the book's website. And with that, I will stop sharing and kind of facilitate a Q&A with Charlene to have more of a dialogue with you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alper. That was really beautiful. You really made families and caregivers of neurodivergent kids feel like kids are kids. There are some things that may be different, but there's a lot of things that are the same, right, in terms of sociability. So this is a question, no surprise. Screen time is a growing topic of debate in schools, and there's lots of people who are advocating for phone bans. How might those policies hinder students with disability who rely on screens as an accommodation?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different ways that phone bans have been approached in schools. My understanding is there's kind of two buckets. One is no phones, none of your own phones during class, but say you could have it during lunch, versus not having any of it the entire day. And there's socially across, I think, kind of bipartisan reactions tend to be that most people think that there's really not necessarily a general reason why a phone outside of assistive uses might be needed in the actual classroom. And I think people tend to separate out when there are accommodations, when things are written into an IEP, whether that needs to be a phone, though, or whether that's an iPad, or whether that's another device is another story, or whether it should be the same device should be used for all these things. So I think that there always needs to be an awareness of where these blanket statements, how they don't end up violating young people's educational rights, who frankly maybe never really actually fully get those rights to begin with, depending on the schools that they're in. So I think the problem with a lot of these conversations is just sort of which parents, not even just which parents, which thought leaders are leading them and which ones aren't. Is it people who are actively working in schools that are leading these conversations? Not necessarily. And so I think that these nuanced perspectives in specific populations are really important to be included.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Alper. So here's a good question. Boy, if we could solve this one. Parent asks, how much is too much tech and social media? As a parent, I don't prescribe length or time, as I know it is my son's way of keeping a social life going.
Yeah, so I think in general, just amount and frequency, to just focus on that doesn't give you the full picture. So even when we're studying something, what in the clinical literature we'd call problematic media use, that tends to be the term people use instead of addiction, because addiction's a really slippery term that how that exactly applies to media and technology. So problematic media use is what people talk about. And it isn't just about amount and frequency, because kids are growing up in this digital environment, and they need to be on screens for school, and to some extent, yes, to socialize. So the focus shouldn't just be about amount. It should be on two other things. It should be how they're using it. So not just you're on a screen and there's an amount of time, but what are you actually doing? And then what are the potential impacts on functioning that media use has? So is this something that is affecting being able to wake up in the morning to go to school, showering, bathing, communicating with family members, sleep, things that we know are tied to mental health, overall well-being, and kind of successful trajectories into adulthood. So that's where I would say that when we're thinking about limits, we're thinking about boundaries, it really is not just about amount, but it is about how kids are using it. And again, this impact on functioning. And I want to go back actually to something that I didn't mention in the question about phone kind of bans and limits, is what is also so lost in this conversation is media literacy and digital citizenship. So kids are going to use phones. They're going to use screens no matter what. Where are they going to learn how to use them? Is it something that is supposed to be, oh, well, it's up to the parents? Well, parents don't necessarily feel like they have the expertise to always be the ones to stay on top of the newest technology or the newest safety features. So there should be a role for educators to, and whether that's kind of school counselors, but I really think that, and especially for a neurodivergent population, really thinking about how there might be taken for granted aspects of the socially networked world that might not be so obvious to them, that you might need to spell out a little bit more to make a little more transparent. So thinking about the ethics of, of using certain platforms and, the ways in which how, for example, how bots maybe try to get people kind of riled up on social media in ways that you have to recognize these aren't real people, and to being able to sort of perspective take on that. These are things that young people need to be able to talk about and not just kind of think about and kind of make their own theories of and sort of get disillusioned about. But so if all we're doing is taking away the phones, and again, maybe it doesn't have to be their phones, but there's no curriculum to fill in that space, well, then I think there's nothing productive ultimately about the use of technology or the non-use of technology in those schools.
Okay, that's really helpful to know. So, Meryl, what if here's a parent they're really struggling with their 15-year-old son. He's neurodivergent. He's been in and out of treatment. He really has been making threats to them when they try to take away his phone to control behavior. He's even said some things that have been reported, and occasionally he will threaten suicide. What do you do when you get to such a difficult point with a kid? Do you have any advice?
So I feel really a lot for this family. I would absolutely say that counseling and mental health treatment have to go hand in hand with any discussions about addressing. It sounds like this child absolutely is dealing with problematic media use. So I think you have to work with clinicians who have expertise in all of these areas and are able to also address some of these underlying factors, mental health issues that maybe kind of underpinning both of these things. So is there anxiety that could be better addressed through whatever means happening here? Are there issues around self-regulation and executive functioning that underpin all of these? Are there sensory dimensions? Is there some sort of, sensory dysregulation that is happening where the transition is very stressful or harmful in a kind of way? So I think that it is a lot of detective work and problem solving, but it takes that holistic people who have expertise in both mental health and problematic media use to get at the bigger picture. And I would say also for a kid who's 15 is to not lose hope, because the adolescent brain is really fully in development deep into your mid-20s. So it's not as if the pathways that are formed are now they're set in stone. At 15, you really do have an opportunity to be in a space where you can develop some of these healthy habits, develop some of this mindfulness. I know, for example, not to make any recommendations clinically, but for example, at Mass General Hospital, there's a Center for Healthy Mind. Yeah, I think it's Healthy Minds, where they do have this sort of holistic expertise. And that's, different if you're not living in Boston or not. But again, I think it's that holistic picture that's important to keep in mind.
All right, thank you. Good advice, Dr. Alper. And I know it's a really difficult thing to be going through with your son. These are all really good questions. We expected good questions, but there are lots of them. So let's keep going. Parent asks, when should parents be concerned about online usage, socializing versus in person. My daughter spends a lot of time online and I'm a little bewildered.
That makes a lot of sense. So for me, I think there is a potentially lovely opportunity for what in the literature we would call like co-use or parental mediation, I guess, where you are spending time using media with your child in a manner that is social, or even where your child is sort of the teacher. So I think that bewilderment is potentially an opportunity and an invitation for your child to be the one teaching you about some area of the internet that she finds fascinating, that she finds interesting, and why. And so again, where it gets to be like concerning is that balance of why the phone, why the social media, why the internet as a social pathway, it absolutely has benefits and can be socially appealing for young people, especially not just those who are neurodivergent, but again, young people who experience anxiety or depression. That the social lift can be easier than in-person interactions. But the element where it's different is, the research that we have on autistic young people's their friendships, it does say that they would prefer on the whole to be interacting in person. The question is, what's the quality of those interactions? So if you're being socially turned away by others, and that's your experience of in-person socializing, then no wonder you might find online spaces to be more welcoming. So maybe in the in-person spaces, maybe, your daughter maybe needs a more neuro-inclusive or neurodivergent fellow group of young people to be socializing with. Maybe that's going to feel less stressful potentially. So again, I think about it as like, what are developmentally appropriate invitations to yourself? Be a kind of researcher with your child, to find out more about their perspectives and what's motivating them.
I like that. Really good advice, bringing your child into helping to solve the problem. All right, Meryl, here's another great question. Parent asks, what do I do if my child does not cease using technology when we've agreed upon and or reacts aggressively when needing to cease using technology? What are our options?
So the violent reaction stuff is a lot deeper, is obviously related to impulse control, executive functioning, mood management. And so having to get at those underlying issues, the technology could be the trigger for those things, and they can, of course, feed back into them. But again, this is why taking the technology away, it doesn't necessarily address those particular underlying issues. So I think what's interesting is if you have a child who, that there's that breaking of the rules, and then even though they've sort of opted into them, I mean, one, it's sort of making the rules even more visible. So, so whether that is, like reminders and things that are visually reminding a child of these things, but also getting them to think through their own self-consequences of what happens how do you feel when you are on it too much? Like, do you feel like it affects how you wake up in the morning? Does it affect your appetite? And so trying to teach mindfulness as part of teaching them about media, I think, is an important thing to scaffold for them. But what's also important, I think, is for parents, because there's anything I think also that some autistic kids are very savvy about. It's recognizing injustice, or what they perceive to be injustice. And so if they see a parent that they say is on their phone all the time, that is also using technology endlessly, and then they're being told that they can't use it in these particular kind of ways, yeah, that's going to get them extra angry. So it does involve that. It's not like you're giving into your kid, but it involves some of that modeling for the autistic young people. Again, because I think that they will many of them be especially keyed into feeling like that there's rules at home that the whole family isn't necessarily abiding by.
And probably also acknowledging that anger, right? I mean, it's so frustrating for a kid, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, kids don't have a lot of agency in their lives in general. So this is one area where they get some choices.
Exactly. All right. Dr. Alper, here's another good question. Do you have any technology recommendations for a 16-year-old girl that does not text because she also has dyslexia and spelling is a big challenge?
So, I don't have any immediate software recommendations. I will say that just in general, text to speech is pretty great these days in terms of the ways that it's embedded into everything. So I think I would kind of work on just text to speech usage where it doesn't have to be typing everything out all the time. That the ways in which voice, I don't even just like voice activated controls like Alexa, but just leaving, you can also leave like on iPhones voicemails for like voice messages as opposed to just text messages. So while maybe building on those strengths, a way to not be socially isolated is to lean on the voice functions of these technologies. Yeah, like voice memos and yeah, again, just like using the, and of course you have to kind of go back and autocorrect but again, that can be also an educational tool of, hey, you want to send this text, let's talk it through. Oh, can you notice the errors in how the voice activation didn't pick it up for you? And that can be something that dyslexic student it's like a kind of, can you find the hidden message? It's a way for them to practice those skills.
Okay, good. So like using voice memo, but then going back through it to make some corrections.
Yes.
Okay. Here's somebody who wants to know if your book is coming out as an audiobook anytime soon.
Not to my knowledge, from the press, but something to bring up with them.
So this parent is asking then, do you know of any text-to-speech apps that are particularly good?
Well, I guess and my, again, frame of reference, unfortunately, is just the Apple devices, but like any time that you text on your phone, in the corner, there's the button that you can press where it's like a little microphone. And you press that and you can just speak into the phone and it will translate your speech into text. And so it's not so much separate apps as it is now part of the platforms themselves.
All right, and a parent is asking if you know anything where it can go from English to Spanish.
Oh yeah, that I am not an expert in. But maybe other parents have, this is where it's so often when it comes to workshops, when it comes to information, I'm good at translating the research and saying, here's what the research says, but the on the ground parent sharing of tips, again, that's even better facilitated from one parent to another.
All right, so parents online, if anybody has an answer to that, drop it in the chat because we all want to know, okay? All right. Here's a question that's tough, but we have to ask it. What if your child starts using the internet for porn and becomes addictive and or seeps out into their interactions with other people inappropriately? A surprising number of people that parent notes the question does come up.
Yeah. So first I want to talk about the reasons why online pornography can be can and often is harmful. Because I think that's as opposed, and then to talk about like how the limits are. Because I think it's important to recognize that that the what is depicted in pornography, especially as it relates to violence against women, as it relates to the subjugation of women, and the ways that can have a relationship to things like dating violence and domestic violence, that those linkages are kind of complicated. And so the pathways to that online pornography might be potentially strengthening. So it isn't just the consumption of this content, but the thing that I think is harmful is thinking about those then like perceptions around gender, sexuality, and violence. And so this is where I think it's like very important to think about. So when that is especially a primary concern, I think, then, and it's not as if, I mean, there's a researcher, for example, at BU who does what she basically calls porn literacy. Like, here's how to think about, like, if kids are going to find it, here's how you should think about it critically. But that's not something that everybody's cup of tea. Then there are frankly ways that you can turn off the Wi-Fi in your home. Like, there are apps and ways that you can block certain websites through your like router to be able to just like stop the ability to access particular websites in your home. I don't have the exact names of these like tools offhand, but so I think that just full on blocking of the IP addresses, if that's the extreme route that you need to take, then that's the route. But at a certain point, if that child leaves the home, then now you've created a situation where it goes from like famine to feast. So again, it's those self-regulation skills. It's talking critically about, hey, did you know that, like, for explaining the research, like, did you know that a lot of the stuff that they show in this content is not how sex actually is, or how it can have an effect on how people treat other people that they date. So I tend to think that there is a way to address things in a way that is, again, like developmentally appropriate, if that's something your child is able to handle. And if not, then like literally just block the websites.
Okay, thank you for that. Oh, Dr. Alper, we have a number of parents asking about screen time limits. So the question is really, how do you know when online activities may be verging onto addiction or a point where it becomes problematic? And parents, I want you to know this is the same question we get in every event, no matter the topic, for neurotypical kids. But we know the reactions can sometimes be a little bit more difficult if your kid is neurodivergent.
Yeah, so there's, when it comes to, for example, the research on problematic media use, it kind of depends what kind of media we're talking about, I suppose. So if we're talking about gaming, that might have a whole different kind of definition. But again, I'll kind of reiterate that it's like when it's a problem is when it's impacting daily functioning. But the kinds of things that can be problematic, for example, about social media, or just using a phone. There's one pathway model that's out there that would say that there's these three things to think through. One is addictive patterns of use. So, for example, scrolling, even though you know that it's kind of that you're kind of zoning out, that you're not even really focused anymore, but an inability to stop scrolling. That would be like an addictive pattern of use. There's also antisocial patterns of use. So using media or technology actively to harm people, so to harass people, to cyberbully people, to dox people, that's a problematic use. Another area is risky patterns of use. So risky could be things like talking with like engaging in meeting up with somebody that you've never really met and you can't really verify their identity. That's a risky behavior. Or even on a really fundamental, like, what is a risk with using your phone? Doing something like texting and driving, because you're so compulsively attached to that device. So that's just one framing of thinking about when something is truly problematic. What are the addictive patterns? What are the antisocial patterns? What are the risky patterns? And thinking about all of those together, all of that relates to how you might address those issues and how they relate.
All right, thank you, Dr. Albert. That makes sense. That's good advice. So it's been a really fast hour. We just have a minute or two left. I wanted to give you just like a minute to give us sort of your closing remarks. What do you most want our parents and caregivers and educators to leave with tonight?
That it's okay to have questions that, still ongoing. And I feel like, people can I'm always kind of publishing new things or finding new research to connect on LinkedIn. There's other podcasts, other interviews and things I've given. And that this is a topic where I think parents have a lot to give in terms of shaping the direction of this research, but also your kids do too. And so I think that the inclusion of young people's voices in how neurodivergent young people and how they would want the research agenda on this to go is so important because they're undercounted and not listened to in so many other aspects of their lives.
That is a really great place to end on. People have been so grateful for your words, Dr. Alper, so we cannot thank you enough for tonight. And everybody, you've been a wonderful audience, so many great questions. I wish we could have gotten them all. Don't you love this? Is where technology is really fun. All those red hearts. So Dr. Meryl Alper, again, thank you for a wonderful event. And thank you to all of our Neurodiversity Education Series partners for being with us tonight. Take care, everybody. Hope to see you again soon. Good night.